There's a strange thing that happens as we get older. We assume we know ourselves, what we like, what we value, what we believe. But if you look closely, you'll notice something unsettling. Most people aren't living as their true selves. They're living as the version of themselves shaped by invisible forces they never questioned. And the real danger? These forces aren't external. They're not countries. They're not places on a map. They're psychological landscapes we wander into without noticing. Today, I want to walk you through 7 places that quietly erode your identity, not by attacking you, but by slowly convincing you to forget who you really are. If you've ever wondered why you feel drained, disconnected, or like pieces of yourself have gone missing, this might be the most important conversation you've heard in a while. And once you see these places clearly, you'll realize they're not prisons. They're exit doors you've simply never tried to open. You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about consciousness, about what makes us who we are beneath all the roles and routines. And one pattern I keep seeing is this. We live in spaces that aren't marked by geography, they're marked by habits of mind, patterns of feeling, ways we've learned to protect ourselves that end up trapping us instead. These places exist entirely inside us, in how we arrange our thoughts, in the invisible structures we build around our hearts. And yet they're more real, more powerful, more dangerous than any physical location could ever be. Most of us spend our entire lives wandering through these places without ever realizing we're trapped. We feel exhausted, anxious, hollow, and we blame ourselves. We think something is fundamentally wrong with us, but what if the problem isn't you at all? What if you're simply living in the wrong psychological neighborhood? Let me start with the first dangerous place. I call it the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine walking into a room where every surface reflects back only what you already believe. Every conversation confirms what you think. Every opinion matches your own. Every fear you have is validated and amplified by a chorus of voices that sound remarkably like your own echo. Now, you might think this sounds rather comfortable, even pleasant, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous. You see, the human mind is not meant to live in perfect agreement with itself. It's meant to be challenged, tested, stretched. When you surround yourself only with people who think exactly as you do, something curious happens. Your mind doesn't grow stronger, it grows more rigid, more brittle, more afraid. I once knew someone who spent all his time with people who shared his exact views about everything. Politics, faith, the proper way to live. He thought he was being wise, staying with his own kind. But what he didn't realize was that his capacity to think was shrinking. Every day, his world became a little smaller, a little more frightening, a little more dependent on the group to tell him what was real. The problem with the Hall of Mirrors is that it makes you terrified of different ideas. A new thought feels like an attack. A different perspective feels like betrayal. You become so identified with your beliefs that questioning them feels like dying. And so you cling even tighter to the mirrors, demanding they show you only what you want to see. But here's what you must understand. When you live in the Hall of Mirrors, you are not really thinking at all. You're simply repeating. You're not growing. You're calcifying. You're not becoming more yourself, you're becoming less. The way out is simple, but not easy. You must deliberately seek out voices that disturb you. Not to argue with them, not to prove them wrong, but simply to feel your own mind stretch. To remember what it's like to not know, to wonder, to question even your most cherished certainties. Because the moment you step out of that mirrored hall and into genuine conversation with someone who sees the world differently, you start to reclaim the flexibility and curiosity that made you truly alive in the first place. But the mind doesn't only shrink when it sees the same reflections. It also collapses when it tries to measure itself against reflections that don't belong to it at all. This brings us to the second dangerous place, the arena of comparison. This is where you measure your worth against everyone else's achievements, status, possessions, success. In this place, nothing you do is ever quite enough because someone somewhere has always done it better, faster, or more impressively. The arena of comparison is peculiar because it disguises itself as motivation. We tell ourselves that comparing ourselves to others will inspire us to improve. But watch what actually happens. When you live in this arena, you don't become inspired. You become exhausted. Every achievement feels hollow because it's not good enough compared to someone else's. Every success is immediately followed by the question, but what about them? I remember hearing about a woman who got a promotion at work, something she'd been working toward for years. But instead of feeling joy, all she could think about was her colleague who had been promoted to an even higher position. Her accomplishment meant nothing because someone else had accomplished more. Do you see the trap? She had given away her power to feel satisfied with her own life. The arena of comparison is built on a fundamental confusion. It treats life as if it were a race with a single finish line, as if there were some objective measure by which all human lives could be ranked. But this is nonsense. Your life is not comparable to anyone else's life. You are not in competition with the rest of humanity. You are on your own path, playing your own game. When you live in the arena of comparison, you stop pursuing what actually brings you joy and start chasing what brings recognition. You stop listening to your own desires and start performing for an imaginary audience. You become so busy keeping score that you forget to actually live. And here's what's especially painful for those of us who are older. We start comparing our current selves to younger people or to who we used to be. We look at what we can't do anymore and feel diminished. We see others traveling, moving freely, accomplishing things, and we measure our worth against their mobility, their energy, their timeline. But that kind of comparison is a thief. It robs you of the particular beauty and wisdom of exactly where you are right now. The escape from this place requires something radical. You must stop measuring altogether. Not occasionally, but completely. You must learn to do things simply because they delight you, not because they will impress anyone. You must recover the capacity to play without keeping score, to create without needing applause, to exist without constantly calculating your rank. Because the truth is, your value was never up for auction in the first place. It was given to you the day you were born, and no achievement or failure can add to it or subtract from it. But while comparison steals your joy from the outside, another place steals it from the inside by teaching you to perform instead of exist. This third dangerous place is what I call the theater of masks. This is where authenticity is punished and performance is rewarded. Here you learn to show only the parts of yourself that are acceptable, impressive, or useful. Everything else must be hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. Now, we all wear masks to some degree. This is natural, even necessary. You don't bare your soul to the grocery clerk or share your deepest fears at a business meeting. But the theater of masks is different. In this place, the mask becomes so thick, so permanent, that you forget there was ever a face beneath it. I knew someone who worked in a place where showing any weakness was considered career death. He learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to agree with ideas he opposed, to hide every part of himself that didn't fit the approved image. And after years of this performance, something terrifying happened. He no longer knew who he really was. The mask had become the only identity he could recognize. This is what the theater of masks does. It doesn't just hide your true self. It erases it slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you reach for yourself and find nothing there. You've become a hollow performance, a walking costume with no one inside. The most insidious part is how exhausting it becomes. Every interaction requires careful calculation. What can I say? What must I hide? How should I appear? You come home from a day in the theater and you're drained. Not from genuine engagement, but from the constant effort of being someone you're not. And here's the cruel joke. The very thing you're trying to achieve through this performance, connection, belonging, acceptance, these things can only be found through authenticity. The performance creates exactly the isolation it's trying to avoid. You become surrounded by people who don't really know you, in relationships that feel strangely empty, receiving approval that means nothing because it's not really for you. The way out of the theater requires courage. You must begin taking off the mask carefully at first, testing to see who stays and who leaves. And yes, some people will leave. Those who preferred your performance to your reality. But this is not loss. This is liberation. Because the people who remain, and the new ones who arrive, will be in relationship with you, not with your costume. They'll see the lines on your face, the uncertainty in your voice, the places where you're still figuring things out, and they'll love you more, not less, because of it. And often, the masks stay on because the alternative speaking the truth feels dangerous in certain environments. This brings us to the fourth dangerous place, the room of silence. Not the good kind of silence, the contemplative stillness where wisdom grows. No, this is the toxic silence where pain is buried, needs are denied, and truth is too dangerous to speak. Many of us grew up in families that operated like this. Everything looked fine on the surface. No screaming, no obvious dysfunction. But beneath the pleasant facade, everyone was slowly suffocating. Feelings weren't expressed, problems weren't addressed, needs were swallowed and hidden. The unspoken rule was simple: don't rock the boat. In the room of silence, you learn that having emotional needs is selfish, that expressing pain is weakness, that the way to maintain peace is to never be honest about what hurts. And so you become very skilled at suffering quietly, at pretending everything is fine, at convincing yourself that numbness is the same as peace. But here's what actually happens in this place. Your emotional needs don't disappear when you ignore them. They accumulate in your body, in your nervous system, creating anxiety you can't explain and depression that seems to come from nowhere. You feel lonely, even when surrounded by family, because no one is really seeing you. You're all performing this elaborate dance of not noticing each other's pain. I heard about a family that prided itself on never fighting. They thought this meant they were close. But when someone spoke to them individually, each person felt desperately alone. The mother was struggling but couldn't say so. The father was overwhelmed but had no one to tell. The children learned that their feelings were inconvenient disruptions to the family's carefully maintained image of perfection. The room of silence teaches you to cope with pain rather than heal from it. It trains you to ask, how can I better tolerate this hurt, rather than, how can I address what's actually wrong? And so you develop all sorts of clever strategies for managing discomfort while never actually resolving anything. The way out requires breaking the silence gently but firmly. It means saying out loud the things that have been hidden, not with anger or blame, but with simple honesty. I'm hurting. I need help. This isn't working for me. It means risking the false peace for the possibility of real connection. And yes, the family system will resist. Silence is comfortable for those who fear honesty. But your liberation is worth the discomfort. But while silence can smother you, the opposite extreme can suffocate you just as effectively. This fifth dangerous place is the storm of noise. This is the opposite of toxic silence. Here, you're bombarded constantly with information, stimulation, demands, distractions. There's always something to read, something to discuss, something requiring your attention. You fill every quiet moment with activity because stillness feels unbearable. And you might think this sounds like modern life, and you'd be partly right. But this place has existed long before our current era. It's anywhere you use external noise to avoid internal truth. Reading the newspaper obsessively to avoid thinking about your marriage, staying endlessly busy with social engagements to escape your own company, filling your mind with other people's problems so you don't have to face your own. The storm of noise is seductive because it feels productive. You're staying informed, staying busy, staying engaged. But watch what happens to your mind in this place. You consume enormous amounts of information but retain almost none of it. You have opinions about everything but deep understanding of nothing. You're exhausted from constant mental activity but can't point to anything you've actually accomplished. I once heard about someone who read multiple newspapers every morning and spent his evenings in endless discussions about current events. He prided himself on being well informed. But when someone asked him what he truly understood, what wisdom he'd gained from all this consumption, he had nothing to say. He'd been filling his mind with noise to avoid the silence where real thinking happens. The storm of noise keeps you in a state of constant reaction. You're always responding to the latest thing, the newest crisis, the most recent outrage. There's no time for contemplation, for integration, for allowing experiences to settle into understanding. And without that settling, nothing you learn actually becomes part of you. It just passes through, leaving you feeling full but somehow still empty. The way out is frightening because it requires turning off the noise and sitting with whatever arises. At first, anxiety will flood in. All the things you've been avoiding will rush to the surface. This is why you kept the noise going in the first place. But if you can stay with the discomfort, something remarkable happens. Your mind begins to clear. Your thoughts become your own again. You start to hear that quiet inner voice that the storm had drowned out for so long. And when all that noise pulls you away from your inner voice, you can end up in the most subtle trap of all, abandoning yourself. This is where you systematically abandon your own truth, your own needs, your own instincts. The sixth dangerous place I call the chamber of self-betrayal. It happens so gradually, you don't even notice. You say yes when everything inside you screams no. You stay in situations that drain you because leaving feels too difficult. You choose what's expected over what's authentic, what's safe over what's true. In the chamber of self-betrayal, you become skilled at ignoring yourself. Someone asks what you want, and you genuinely don't know because you've spent so long considering only what others want, what seems practical, what will avoid conflict. Your gut instincts, which were once clear and strong, become faint whispers you've learned to disregard. I knew someone who spent something like 2 decades in a career she didn't care about, married to someone she didn't truly love, living in a city that depressed her. When asked why, she said it was what made sense. Her family approved, the job was secure, the marriage was stable. She'd built her entire life on what seemed reasonable to everyone else while completely ignoring what felt right to her. This is what the chamber of self-betrayal does. It convinces you that maturity means ignoring your desires, that responsibility means betraying your truth, that being a good person means abandoning yourself. And so you make 1,000 small compromises, each one barely noticeable, until you wake up one day and realize you're living someone else's life entirely. The cruelest part is that society often rewards self-betrayal. You're called mature when you ignore your needs, responsible when you sacrifice your happiness, selfless when you put everyone else first. But this is not virtue. This is slow spiritual death. You cannot love others authentically while betraying yourself. You cannot give from an empty well. The way out requires something that may feel selfish at first. You must begin checking in with yourself again. What do I actually want? What does this feel like in my body? What is my truth, regardless of what others expect? And then, most frightening of all, you must begin making choices based on these answers. Some people will be disappointed. This is inevitable. But your life belongs to you, not to their expectations. You've earned the right, after all these years, to finally live according to your own compass. But the deepest danger comes from the place most people never explore, the part of themselves they locked away long ago. The seventh and most dangerous place is the basement of shadows. This is the internal space where you've locked away all the parts of yourself you're too afraid or ashamed to face. Every painful memory, every shameful thought, every quality you've decided is unacceptable, down into the basement they go. Now, you might think this sounds like a good strategy. Push down the bad stuff and focus on being good. But here's what actually happens. What you bury doesn't stay buried. It grows stronger in the darkness, influencing your behavior in ways you don't understand. You find yourself overreacting to small things, sabotaging your own success, repeating patterns you swore you'd never repeat, and you can't figure out why, because the real cause is locked in the basement. I knew someone who despised his father's anger, swore he'd never be like that, prided himself on being calm and controlled. But then he had children, and to his horror, he found himself raging at them over tiny things. He had locked his own anger in the basement, thinking he'd gotten rid of it, but it had simply been waiting in the dark, gathering strength, until it burst out in exactly the way he feared. This is what the basement of shadows does. Every quality you reject in yourself doesn't disappear, it goes underground and starts running your life from the unconscious. You judge others harshly for traits you secretly fear in yourself. You attract situations that force you to confront what you've been avoiding. You become quite literally possessed by the parts of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. But here's the remarkable thing. The shadow basement doesn't just contain what you fear. It also holds tremendous power, creativity, and vitality. That anger you buried might become passionate advocacy once you face it. That sadness might become deep empathy. That shame might become fierce compassion for others who struggle with similar issues. The way out of the basement requires descent, not avoidance, not denial, but the courage to go down into the darkness with a light and see what's actually there. Not to judge it, not to fight it, but simply to acknowledge it. Yes, this is also part of me. And in that acknowledgement, the shadow loses its power to control you unconsciously. You become whole again, integrated, no longer at war with yourself. So here we are, 7 places that destroy your true self. The hall of mirrors that makes you rigid and afraid. The arena of comparison that makes your achievements meaningless. The theater of masks that erases your authentic face. The room of silence that buries your truth. The storm of noise that drowns your inner voice. The chamber of self-betrayal where you abandon yourself gradually. And the basement of shadows where you hide from your wholeness. But recognizing these places is only the beginning. The question now is, how do you leave? How do you reclaim yourself? You must become conscious. You must look honestly at where you are. Not where you pretend to be, not where you wish you were, but where you actually spend your psychological time. Which of these places do you inhabit daily? Take a moment right now and ask yourself, which one feels most familiar? Which description made you uncomfortable because it hit too close to home? That discomfort is not your enemy, it's your guide. It's showing you exactly where you need to focus your attention, and then you must begin to leave. Not all at once, not dramatically, but deliberately. Start limiting your time in toxic environments. Set boundaries with people who demand your mask. Create space for silence where your inner voice can speak. Make small choices based on your own truth rather than external expectations. Begin the slow work of integrating what you've hidden in the basement. This won't make you popular. People who are comfortable in these places will feel threatened by your departure. They'll call you selfish for setting boundaries, weird for being authentic, antisocial for needing silence, irresponsible for following your truth. Let them. Your freedom is worth their discomfort. And here's what you'll discover on the other side. When you leave these dangerous places, you don't just feel better, you become different. Your relationships deepen because they're based on truth rather than performance. Your days become meaningful because they come from your authentic self. Your mind clears because it's no longer filled with noise and comparison. You feel alive again because you've stopped abandoning yourself. But perhaps most importantly, you give others permission to leave too. When you stop participating in these toxic patterns, you create an opening for others to escape. Your family might begin speaking truth. Your friends might remove their masks. Your community might become more human, not because you preached at them, but simply because you showed them another way is possible. You see, these dangerous places persist because we collectively agree to inhabit them. But when enough individuals choose freedom, the whole system shifts. One person's liberation creates ripples that spread far beyond what you can see. So ask yourself right now, which of these places have you called home? Where are you spending your psychological energy? What would it take to leave? Because here's the beautiful truth, you are not stuck. These places have no walls except the ones you believe in. The hall of mirrors, walk toward a different voice. The arena of comparison, stop keeping score. The theater of masks, take off the costume. The room of silence, speak your truth. The storm of noise, turn it off. The chamber of self-betrayal, choose yourself. The basement of shadows, descend with curiosity instead of fear. Your true self is not destroyed. It's simply been buried under layers of accommodation, performance, and fear. But it's still there, waiting patiently for you to remember who you actually are beneath all the costumes and compromises. The meaning of your life is not to successfully navigate these dangerous places. The meaning is to recognize them, leave them, and discover what remains when you're no longer defending, performing, or hiding. What remains is you, the real you, the one who is always there watching, waiting, ready to live again. And when you find that self, you'll wonder how you ever mistook these prisons for homes. You'll see clearly that freedom was always available, always just one honest choice away. The door was never locked. You were simply afraid to open it. But now you know. The 7 dangerous places exist, yes, but so does the way out. And the way out begins with seeing where you are, admitting it honestly, and taking one small step toward truth. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, but now. Always now. This is your invitation not to perfection, not to some distant achievement, but to the simple act of coming home to yourself, to living from your center instead of from fear, to playing your own music instead of dancing to someone else's tune. The dangerous places will always be there, offering their false comforts and familiar prisons. But you don't have to accept the invitation. You can choose differently. And that choice, made quietly in your own heart right now, might be the most important decision of your entire life. Because what good is a life spent in these places? What's the point of surviving if you've lost yourself in the process? Your true self is calling. Not from some distant future, but from right here, right now, beneath all the layers of protection and performance. It's been waiting for you to remember, waiting for you to come home. The question is, will you answer? If this breakdown of the 7 dangerous places helped you see your own journey more clearly, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments which place you've spent the most time in and which one you're ready to leave behind. And if you found this valuable, make sure to like the video and subscribe so more people can discover how to reclaim their true selves as well. Your engagement truly helps this message reach others who might need it. Most people go through life believing everything depends on their seriousness, their plans, their responsibilities, the way the world sees them. But have you ever noticed that the harder you grip life, the more it seems to slip through your fingers? Moments you thought were life and death eventually become stories you laugh about. Jobs that once felt like the center of your universe fade into distant memories, and the problems that once kept you awake at night somehow weren't as permanent as they felt. Today, I want to explore a perspective that can genuinely change your experience of life. A reminder that existence isn't just about pressure, deadlines, or proving anything to anyone. Much of life is a game, and the real freedom comes from seeing the game as a game. Not trivial, but playful. Not irresponsible, but liberating. If you clicked on this video, maybe you're tired of carrying weight that was never meant to be carried alone, and maybe it's time to breathe again. So let's start by questioning the one assumption almost everyone carries, that life must always be approached with seriousness. Think about how you were raised. From the time you could walk and talk, adults around you communicated one central message: take things seriously. Do your homework seriously. Choose your career seriously. Raise your family seriously. Plan for retirement seriously. And beneath all of that was an unspoken equation: your worth as a person equals how seriously you take your responsibilities. Now, I'm not saying responsibility doesn't matter. Of course it does. But somewhere along the way, we confused responsibility with a constant state of tension. We started to believe that if we weren't worried, we weren't caring. If we weren't stressed, we weren't working hard enough. If we weren't anxious, we must be doing something wrong. And that belief, that's what steals the joy right out of living. Society teaches you that seriousness is proof of strength, but I've come to see it differently. Often, seriousness is proof that you've forgotten something deeper. It's a sign that you're so absorbed in the role you're playing, parent, employee, provider, achiever, that you've lost sight of the fact that you're playing a role at all. You've become the character in the story, and you've forgotten there's someone watching from behind the curtain. And here's the thing, this kind of seriousness doesn't just create stress, it creates a constant, gnawing fear of getting it wrong. Because if your entire identity is wrapped up in playing your part perfectly, then any mistake, any deviation, any moment where you don't live up to expectations becomes a threat to your very existence. That's exhausting. That's the hidden cost of taking life too seriously. But what if seriousness isn't the proof of strength, but a sign we've forgotten something deeper? Let me share something that changed the way I see the world. I started to notice that most of the things we do, our jobs, our social roles, even the way we organize society, they all operate like games. Now, be careful with that word. I don't mean games as in trivial, meaningless activities. I mean games in the way a musician plays an instrument. There's structure, there are rules, there's skill involved, but the act itself is done for its own sake. It's play. Think about a concert pianist. They practice for years. They master incredibly complex pieces. They perform in front of thousands of people. But at the end of the day, they're playing, and the beauty of their performance comes precisely from the fact that they're not playing under the weight of some cosmic life or death pressure. They're engaged, they're present, they're sincere, but they're not burdened by a belief that the universe will collapse if they hit a wrong note. Now contrast that with someone who approaches every aspect of their life as if it's a matter of survival. Every decision is heavy, every mistake is catastrophic, every day is a test they might fail. That person isn't playing, they're enduring, and the difference between those two experiences is everything. Most of human life, when you really look at it, is a series of games we've agreed to play together. The economy is a game. Politics is a game. Social status is a game. Even family roles are games, in a sense. They're meaningful, yes. They shape our lives, absolutely. But they're not absolute truths handed down from the cosmos. They're structures we created, and we can relate to them with either crushing seriousness or engaged playfulness. And here's what I've noticed. The games are best played when you know they're games. When you take them seriously, when you forget that they're just structures, you lose your flexibility. You lose your creativity, you lose your sense of humor, you become rigid, anxious, defensive. But when you remember that you're playing, something shifts. You become lighter, more adaptable, more present. You stop gripping so hard. This doesn't mean you become irresponsible. It doesn't mean you stop caring. In fact, I'd argue you care more deeply when you're not paralyzed by fear. A musician who remembers they're playing music performs better than one who's terrified of making a mistake. A parent who remembers they're guiding a child, not controlling an outcome, raises healthier kids. A person who remembers their job is one part of their life, not the totality of their identity, actually does better work. But most of us were never taught this. We were taught that the game is the only reality, that if you step outside the agreed upon roles and rules, you'll be lost. You'll be nobody. You won't belong. And that fear of not belonging keeps people locked into a seriousness that slowly drains the life out of them. I look at the world sometimes and I see people who are so far out, so lost in the seriousness of the game they're playing that they've completely forgotten where they started. They're convinced they're there. Wherever there is some position, some status, some identity. But under all that assurance, there's anxiety, deep, constant anxiety. Because when you believe the game is all there is, losing becomes unbearable. And when you see life as play, something surprising begins to happen to the way you judge both yourself and others. You start to see that everyone is playing a part. The boss who seems so intimidating, playing a role. The neighbor who always seems to have it together, playing a role. Even you, the version of yourself you present to the world, that's a role too. And none of those roles are the full truth of who any of you actually are. This realization is both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because you see that the identity you've built up over decades, the one you've defended, polished, worried over, is just a mask you've been wearing. Liberating, because you realize you can take the mask off. You're not your job, you're not your bank account, you're not even your name. Those are just parts you've played in the game of being human. Now, society doesn't like it when you realize this. Society depends on people taking their roles seriously. It needs workers who believe their work defines them. It needs consumers who believe their purchases define them. It needs citizens who believe their political affiliations define them. Because if too many people step back and say, wait a minute, this is just a game I've been playing, the whole structure starts to wobble. That's why humor, real, deep humor, is often seen as subversive. The person who laughs at the things everyone else takes seriously is dangerous. Not because they're mocking what matters, but because they're reminding everyone that what we think matters might not matter quite as much as we've been told. They're the court jester who can say the truth because they're not invested in the game the way everyone else is. And here's the strange part. The people who are most lost in the game, the ones who are most serious, most anxious, most convinced that everything depends on them, those people are often congratulated. They're called dedicated, responsible, hardworking, and in a way, they are. It takes a certain kind of courage to get that lost, to care that much, to invest yourself so completely in something that's ultimately temporary. But to keep those far-out people from going completely insane, there have to be people who remember, people who stay connected to something deeper, people who keep one foot in the game and one foot in the reality behind the game. You could think of them like a prompter in a theater, the person backstage with the script, making sure the actors on stage don't lose the thread entirely. They're the ones who remember that before the performance started, there was a green room, a place of stillness, a place where the actors could just be themselves. In the metaphor of existence, that green room is the center, the still point, the place where you're not playing any role at all. You're not a parent, not a worker, not a success or a failure. You're just here, present, aware. And every once in a while, in the middle of the chaos of life, you get a glimpse of that green room. A moment where all the roles fall away and you just exist, without needing to be anything in particular. Those moments are rare for most people, but they become more common as you get older. I think that's one of the hidden gifts of aging that nobody talks about. When you're young, you're so caught up in building your identity, proving yourself, achieving things. But somewhere past 60, 65, 70, you start to realize that a lot of what you thought was so important wasn't the job you stressed over. Someone else is doing it now. The reputation you fought to build, most people have forgotten. The things you thought defined you, they've already faded. And at first, that realization can feel like loss. But if you sit with it long enough, it becomes freedom. Because if all those things you spent decades worrying about didn't ultimately define you, then who are you really? And that question, when you're ready for it, opens up a completely different way of living. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop gripping, and you start noticing. Noticing the light in the afternoon, the sound of the wind, the way your body moves, the way your mind wanders. You start experiencing life as it actually is, rather than as a series of tests you need to pass. Some people call this wisdom. I think it's more like remembering that you were never just the role you played. You were always something bigger, something quieter, something that didn't need to be proven or defended. But here's the paradox that trips people up, and this is where things get really interesting. Once you realize that freedom comes from letting go, from not taking life so seriously, you might be tempted to try to make it happen. You might think, okay, I need to become enlightened. I need to achieve that state of not caring. And the moment you do that, you've already lost. Because now you're treating letting go as another goal to achieve, another game to win. You've turned liberation into a project. And projects require seriousness. This is the trap of every spiritual path, every self-help philosophy, every attempt to improve yourself. The moment you decide you must become something, even if that something is free or awakened or at peace, you've created a new source of anxiety. You've given yourself a new role to play, a new standard to meet, a new way to fail, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So what do? You can't try to let go, because trying defeats the purpose. But you can't just ignore the problem either, because the weight is still there. You're stuck, paralyzed, caught between needing to change and realizing that trying to change is part of the problem. And that's exactly where the breakthrough happens. Not in the doing, but in the seeing. When you really look at what you're doing, when you watch yourself trying to be spontaneous, trying to be free, trying to not care, you start to see how absurd it is. You're commanding yourself to do something that can only happen naturally. You're trying to surprise yourself on purpose. It's like trying to plan a surprise party for yourself. The moment you know about it, it's not a surprise anymore. But then something shifts. As you sit with that impossibility, as you really feel the bind you've put yourself in, you start to notice something you've been missing the entire time. You notice that you're already doing what you thought you needed to achieve. You're already spontaneous. You always have been. Think about it. Someone says good morning to you, and you respond. Did you rehearse that? Did you plan what words would come out? Or did they just appear? You grew your hair without deciding to. Your heart beats without permission. Your lungs breathe while you're thinking about something else entirely. Thoughts arise in your mind that you didn't consciously manufacture. Even this moment right now, you're experiencing something you didn't script or control. Everything you are is already happening spontaneously. Your entire existence is an unfolding that you're not in charge of. And here's the beautiful irony. You spent all that time trying to be spontaneous, trying to let go, trying to live in the present moment. And there was never a moment when you weren't in the present. There's literally nowhere else to be. Even when you're worrying about the future, you're worrying right now. Even when you're remembering the past, you're remembering in this moment. Your memory is a present activity. Your planning is a present activity. There's no way to not be here. There's no way to not be spontaneous. You've been trying to achieve something you already had. And when that lands, when you really see it, the only appropriate response is laughter. Not a polite chuckle, but deep, relieving laughter. The kind that comes from realizing you've been searching everywhere for your glasses while they were on your head the whole time. You were free all along. You just didn't notice because you were too busy trying to become free. This is where anxiety transforms into something completely different. I've spent a lot of time thinking about anxiety and laughter, and I've come to realize they're not opposites, they're the same phenomenon interpreted two different ways. Life is vibration. It's movement. It's energy oscillating back and forth. The question is, how are you going to interpret that vibration? Is it tremble, tremble, tremble? Or is it laugh, laugh, laugh? Think about shadows. You can have shadows of horror or shadows of delight, but they're the same shadows. The darkness is the same. What changes is your relationship to it. Think about tears. You can have tears of grief or tears of joy, but they're the same tears. The water is the same. What changes is the meaning you give them. Anxiety is what happens when you interpret the vibration of life as a threat. When you see all the movement, all the uncertainty, all the constant change as evidence that something's wrong, that you're in danger, that you need to control everything or it'll all fall apart, that vibration becomes trembling. It becomes fear. It becomes the feeling that you're barely holding on. But laughter, real laughter, is what happens when you interpret that same vibration as play. When you see all the movement, all the uncertainty, all the constant change as evidence that life isn't as serious as you thought, that the things you were gripping so tightly weren't as solid as they appeared, that the whole drama you've been living was always just a drama meaningful, yes, but not the final word on existence. And here's what's fascinating. Sometimes people flip from one interpretation to the other in an instant. Something that terrified them yesterday becomes hilarious today. Not because the situation changed, but because they changed their relationship to it. They saw it from a different angle. They remembered that it's all temporary. They remembered that they're bigger than the role they've been playing. I think this is why older people often develop a sense of humor about things that would have devastated them when they were younger. They've lived long enough to see the pattern. They've watched crises come and go. They've seen relationships end and new ones begin. They've lost jobs and found new paths. They've been convinced something was the end of the world, only to discover it was just the end of a chapter. And with enough repetitions of that pattern, something inside relaxes. The vibration that used to feel like anxiety starts to feel more like movement. Just movement. Not good or bad. Not threatening or promising. Just the natural rhythm of existence doing what it does. But to truly understand why laughter matters, we have to talk about the fear that defines most of adulthood. The big one. The fear that sits underneath almost every other fear. The fear of death. Most people live their entire lives convinced that death is the ultimate threat, the final ending, the moment when everything you are just stops. And if that's true, if death really is absolute nothingness forever, then of course life becomes a desperate scramble. Of course you have to grip tightly to everything. Of course you can't relax. Because relaxing might mean losing, and losing might mean death, and death means you never existed at all. But that belief is based on a misunderstanding, a fundamental error in how we think about existence. Let me ask you something. Can you have up without down? Can you have left without right? Can you have an up crest of a wave without a down crest? Obviously not. They're two sides of the same thing. You can't have one without the other. They define each other. Now apply that same logic to existence and non-existence. Can you have being without non-being? Can you have something without nothing? Can you have life without death? And if they necessarily go together like two sides of a coin, then death isn't the opposite of life. It's the other half of life. It's the down crest that makes the up crest possible. Think about it this way. If there had never been a time when you didn't exist, would you even notice that you exist now? If there's no contrast, there's no experience. If there's no off, there's no on. The very fact that you exist right now depends on the fact that there were billions of years when you didn't. And the fact that you'll someday not exist is what gives this moment its shape, its texture, its significance. People argue about whether the universe will end, whether it'll all run down into some final stable state where nothing ever happens again. Some people find that thought terrifying. But I've always had this intuition that what happened once can happen again. If the universe exploded into existence once, if something came from nothing once, then why wouldn't it happen again? And again. And again? Because nothing and something aren't separate states. They're two phases of the same process. Like breathing in and breathing out. Like waking and sleeping. Like day and night. You can't have just one. They oscillate. They cycle. They create each other. And when you really see that, when you understand that existence is eternal, not in the sense of one long continuous line, but in the sense of an endless rhythm of appearing and disappearing, the fear of death loses its grip. Because you realize you've already done this countless times. You've already emerged from nothing. You've already been born. And whatever happens after you die will be, in some sense, the same kind of nothing you emerged from before you were born. Do you remember being afraid before you were born? Do you remember that nothingness being a problem? Of course not, because it wasn't a problem. It was just the other half of the wave, the silence between the notes, the space that makes the music possible. Now, I'm not saying there won't be painful experiences in your future. I'm not saying you won't face illness, loss, grief, or physical suffering. Those are real. But here's what changes when you stop interpreting life as a desperate fight against death. Pain stops meaning what it used to mean. Most suffering isn't the pain itself, it's the story you tell about the pain. It's the interpretation that says, this is destroying me, this is moving me toward the end, this is evidence that I'm losing. When you believe that, pain becomes unbearable, because you're not just feeling the sensation, you're fighting it with everything you have, trying to make it stop, trying to survive. But I've read accounts of people who've gone through extreme experiences, people who've faced torture, people who've endured unimaginable pain, and there's a strange pattern that emerges. The people who suffer most are the ones who resist most. The ones who fight the pain, who tense against it, who tell themselves it's destroying them. But the ones who somehow let go, who stop resisting, who stop interpreting the sensation as a threat, something shifts. The pain doesn't necessarily decrease, but it stops being suffering. It becomes just experience. Intense experience, yes, but without the layer of terror on top of it. This is a hard thing to understand if you haven't experienced it. It sounds almost like I'm saying pain doesn't matter, and that's not what I mean at all. What I mean is that how you relate to pain determines whether it destroys you or whether you can move through it, and how you relate to pain depends on what you think it means. If pain means I'm being destroyed, I'm dying, this is the end, then it's torture. But if pain is just sensation, just the nervous system doing what nervous systems do, then it's something you can be present with. Not because you're strong or special, but because you're not adding the extra layer of terror on top of the physical sensation. Let me give you a simpler example. Imagine you're lying in bed at night and you hear all the sounds around you. Cars passing, a plane overhead, a dog barking, someone's air conditioner humming. If you're just listening, those sounds might be interesting. You might even find them beautiful in their randomness. But now imagine someone told you that you had to listen to those sounds, that it was a test, that you'd be judged on how well you listened. Suddenly the same sounds become irritating, distracting, maybe even maddening. The sounds didn't change. Your relationship to them changed. The meaning you gave them changed. And that change in meaning changed your entire experience. Life works the same way. The events themselves, the pain, the loss, the uncertainty, the endings, they're like the sounds. They just are. But the meaning you give them determines whether you experience them as suffering or simply as experience. And the meaning you give them depends on whether you believe you're in a desperate fight for survival or whether you remember that existence is bigger than any single wave in the ocean. This doesn't make you immune to pain. It doesn't make loss easy, but it does change the quality of your experience. Because you're no longer convinced that every difficult moment is evidence of your imminent destruction. You're no longer gripping so tightly to life that any change feels like death. You're letting the wave move through you, knowing that waves always move, and that's what makes the ocean alive. So what is the lesson in all of this? It's not about ignoring life, it's about lightening the weight you place on it. Everything I've been talking about comes down to this. You've been carrying weight that was never meant to be carried. You've been taking responsibility for things you were never in control of. You've been treating temporary roles as permanent identities. You've been interpreting the natural vibration of life as evidence of threat, when it was only ever evidence of movement. Life is a series of roles you play and rhythms you move through. Some of those roles are beautiful, some are difficult, some last decades, and some last moments. But none of them are who you actually are. Who you are is the awareness watching the roles, the stillness underneath the movement, the space in which all the games happen. And when you remember that when you step back just enough to see the game as a game, everything becomes lighter, not meaningless, not trivial, but lighter. Because you're no longer convinced that your entire existence depends on playing your part perfectly. You're no longer terrified that one wrong move will destroy you. You're playing with skill, with care, with sincerity, but you're playing. Seriousness closes you off. It makes you rigid, defensive, anxious, but play opens you up. It makes you flexible, curious, present. And here's the strange thing. When you play, you often perform better than when you're serious. A musician who's playing music performs better than one who's terrified of making a mistake. A person who's engaged in their work without being identified with it does better work than someone who's constantly anxious about their performance. This is the paradox. Letting go doesn't make you less effective, it makes you more effective. Because you're no longer paralyzed by fear. You're no longer wasting energy, gripping, and controlling. You're moving with life instead of against it. And that's what transforms anxiety into laughter. Not because life becomes easy, but because you remember that the game was never as serious as you thought. The things you feared were never as permanent as they seemed. And the identity you've been defending was never who you truly are. Life was never meant to be survived, with clenched fists, white knuckles, and a constant sense of emergency. It was meant to be experienced with curiosity, with humor, with presence, with the lightness that comes from knowing that you're part of something much bigger than the role you're currently playing. If this perspective gave you even a moment of relief, a moment where the pressure dropped from your shoulders, where you remembered that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to carry all of this so seriously, then I invite you to stay with this channel. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, which part helped you breathe a little easier today? What shifted for you? What are you ready to stop taking so seriously? Your experiences matter. Your voice helps others see life with a little less weight and a little more freedom. Because the truth is, we're all playing this game together. And the more of us who remember it's a game, the better we all play. The lighter we all become, the more we can laugh together at the beautiful absurdity of being human. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And remember, you're already free. You always have been. You just forgot for a while. And that's okay. Forgetting is part of the game too.